The first thing I understood about this universe was not its violence, nor its cruelty, nor even its endless war, but its exhaustion, a soul-deep fatigue that clung to every atom like old blood soaked into stone. And I realized this as I fell laughing through a sky that did not care whether gods lived or died. My body torn from the familiar madness of branching realities and flung into a void where the stars themselves looked tired of shining. I am Loki Lofisan, son of Frost, prince of lies, breaker of destinies. And I have died 1,000 symbolic deaths across realms that treat causality as a suggestion. Yet nothing prepared me for the moment my laughter echoed and was swallowed whole. As though the universe itself had placed a finger to its cracked lips and whispered that humor was a luxury no longer permitted here. And as I drifted downward toward a planet wrapped in smog and prayer, its continents stitched together by hive cities so vast they blotted out the horizon, I tasted the psychic residue of uncountable minds screaming the same plea in different languages. Survive, Oberdand. Those prayers did not rise to a single loving God but scattered like spilled grain into the waiting moors of unseen things beyond reality, and I felt their attention brush against me, slow and curious the way an ocean notices a drop of poison. I landed softly atop a cathedral spire kilometers above the choking streets, my boots resting on sigils carved by hands long since turned to dust, and I wore the face of a saint because it felt appropriate, because this was a place where belief was enforced, with guns, and disbelief punished with fire, and below me billions lived and died, never knowing the sky, except as a rumor sold by priests, and I smiled at them, because I always smile, because smiling reminds lesser beings that chaos has a personality. Yet my smile tightened as I listened to the city breathe, each breath a groan of machinery and suffering, and I realized that lies here were not whispered in shadows but engraved into law, hammered into armor, taught to children as holy truth. And when I walked among them disguised as a scribe of the administratum, murmuring tiny distortions into ledgers and immense numbers, altered dates, shifted names, misplaced the consequences rippled outward with horrifying efficiency, entire hablocks purged for accounting errors, families erased because a birth record no longer aligned with a decree written 3 centuries earlier, and no one questioned it, no one rebelled, they only bowed their heads and thanked the emperor for the clarity of punishment. And in that obedience I felt a strange chill, because deception had no resistance here, it had already won long before I arrived, and as days passed, I learned of the corpse god on Terra rotting yet ruling, worshipped as divine by an empire that insisted it was secular. A contradiction so vast it could only exist because trillions believed it without understanding it. And I laughed again, quietly, because such a god would have amused me once, a tyrant sustained by ritual and denial. But the laughter faltered when I brushed the edges of the warp, that screaming dimension where thoughts become storms and emotions grow teeth, and something noticed me there, something vast and layered and patient. A god of change that did not lie for pleasure but for inevitability, whose schemes spanned millennia rather than moments. And I felt suddenly small, not weak but redundant, as though my cleverness were a child's trick in a universe where deception had been industrialized. And when cultists began to dream of me without my prompting, carving my symbol into their flesh, believing me a demon of their own pantheon, I understood the true horror of this place. Identity here was not chosen but consumed. Gods were shaped by belief until they broke beneath its weight. And I, who had always bent belief to my will, felt it pressing in on me from all sides, reshaping me whether I wished it or not, and standing once more upon a spire as orbital guns thundered in the distance and a planet burned for reasons already forgotten. I felt that same attention return, heavier now, amused, assessing, and for the first time in all my long rebellion against fate, I wondered if I had not arrived here as a conqueror or a catalyst, but as raw material, something this universe would grind down and remake until even a god of lies learned what it meant to fear being outmatched in deception. And far above, beyond the veil, the warp laughed, not sharply, not joyfully, but endlessly, while the Imperium below continued its prayers, unaware that a new myth had begun bleeding quietly into its already poisoned history. It was not the gunfire or the screams that followed me first, but the paperwork, the endless suffocating bureaucracy that strangled this galaxy more effectively than any blade. And I learned this as I allowed myself to be captured, because sometimes the best way to understand a lie is to let it cage you and listen to how it justifies the bars. They took me in chains of sanctified steel, chanting prayers. They did not understand hauling me through corridors carved from black stone and bone where the air tasted of incense and fear. And I wore the face of a trembling heretic because it made them comfortable. Because terror was expected, catalogued, processed, and I watched the Imperium at work from the inside. Watched men and women who had never known a sunrise beyond polluted clouds carry out cruelty not with hatred, but with clerical boredom, Stamping seals onto death warrants the way a child stamps wax onto letters. And I felt something twist inside me as I realized that no one here believed themselves cruel. They believed themselves correct, and correctness was more sacred than mercy. They interrogated me for weeks, asking questions whose answers were predetermined, whose purpose was not truth but confirmation of doctrine, and every time I spoke a lie, it slid into place perfectly welcomed because it reinforced what they already wished to hear. And I saw then that the Imperium did not fear deception. It feared deviation, originality, the dangerous possibility that something new might exist. And that fear had calcified into tradition so dense it could crush entire worlds without ever acknowledging the pressure. And when I was finally brought before an inquisitor, a man whose soul burned like a dying star fed by paranoia and faith, I expected challenge, suspicion, perhaps even admiration, but instead I found myself dissected, not as an enemy but as a symptom, another anomaly to be classified and erased. And as he spoke of chaos, of demons and false gods and corruption, I felt the shadow of the warp coil tighter around my thoughts, amused by the irony that he could describe damnation with perfect accuracy and still not recognize it in himself. And I understood then that this galaxy did not produce heroes or villains, only functions, and gods here were not worshipped for love, but for utility, weapons forged from belief and pointed at eternity. They sentenced me to cleansing, to psychic scrutiny, and I allowed it, opening myself just enough to let their sanctioned psychers glimpse fragments of matrixed tales, half-truths, smiling betrayals, and the shock that rippled through them was exquisite and terrible. Minds fracturing not because I attacked them, but because their framework could not accommodate a god who did not fit neatly into their categories of demon or saint. And as alarms wailed and one psyker began to laugh uncontrollably, I felt the warp surge like a tide answering a distant moon, and something vast leaned closer, tasting the chaos, and in that moment of confusion, I escaped, not with fire or illusion but with a whisper planted in the Inquisitor's mind, a single doubt carefully shaped to metastasize, and I knew with grim satisfaction that he would spend the rest of his life hunting ghosts that were not there, purging innocence to silence a question he could never quite remember asking, free again in the Underhive where sunlight was a myth and humanity lived layered like sedimentary rock. I walked among mutants and forgotten things, and they saw me, not as a saint but as something familiar, something honest in its dishonesty, and they whispered my name in dozens of variations, folding me into their desperate folklore, and each whisper fed me power I did not want, because I could feel it changing me, aligning me not with mischief but with entropy. And when cultists began to paint my sigil beside that of the Changer of Ways, I felt a cold certainty settle in my bones. This universe would not allow a god to remain independent for long. It would subsume me into its endless war of concepts and horrors. And standing beneath a collapsing manufactorum while servitors marched past carrying the remains of yesterday's rebellion, I felt the presence beyond the veil smile, patient and possessive. And I knew that my next trick would not be against mortals or empires, but against gods who believed they had already won. And for the first time I was unsure whether my cleverness would save me or merely make my fall more entertaining to watch. I began to notice the dreams before I noticed the worship, because dreams are honest in a way prayers are not. And across the hive world they started to ripple outward like a sickness that wore a smile. Men and women dreaming of doors that led nowhere, of laughter echoing down corridors that had no mouths, of bargains struck with shadows that asked for nothing, and somehow took everything. And though I had not seeded these visions myself, they bore my cadence, my rhythm, as though the warp were practicing my voice using stolen throats. And that unsettled me more than any blade ever could, because imitation is a form of ownership in this universe. I walked the streets at night wearing no disguise at all, letting my true shape flicker at the edges of perception, and I watched people sense me without seeing me, their faith bending instinctively to accommodate a new myth. And I understood then that belief here was not passive, it was aggressive. It hunted for symbols to fill its hunger, and I was becoming one whether I desired it or not. And when I reached out into the warp to still the dreams, to pull back the threads being woven around me, my thoughts brushed against something impossibly vast, layered with intentions stacked like palimpsests over millennia, a presence that did not announce itself with thunder or fire but with inevitability, and it spoke not in words but in outcomes, showing me futures where my name was etched into cult mantras beside the Changer of Ways, futures where I was no longer Loki but an aspect, a mask worn by a god that had never needed a face until now. I recoiled, laughing sharply to break the tension, but the laughter echoed back, altered, stretched thin, as though the warp itself were testing how much of me it could swallow without choking. And in that moment I realized the cruel elegance of this reality's gods, that they did not conquer rivals, they absorbed them, turned uniqueness into flavor, rebellion into ornamentation, and as the dreams intensified, so did the Imperium's response. Black ships arriving to harvest psychers whose only crime had been dreaming too vividly. Entire hab levels sealed and purged because sleep itself had become suspicious. And I watched this unfold with a sickness curling in my gut, because my presence had become another variable in an equation whose solution was always suffering, and I began to understand why even chaos gods here were locked in endless stalemate, because victory would require change, and change itself was the one resource this galaxy could not afford. I attempted a greater deception then, a risky one, weaving a false prophecy into the dreams of an entire manufacturum city, guiding them toward a rebellion designed not to overthrow, but to confuse, to stall the machinery of oppression long enough for something like hope to breathe. But the result was horrifyingly efficient. The rebellion crushed within hours, its leaders publicly executed, their deaths broadcast as instructional material, and the dream twisted afterward, repurposed into a cautionary tale about false gods and seductive lies. And I felt a jolt of genuine fear as I realized that even my failures were being weaponized, folded neatly into the Imperium's narrative, and far above, beyond the screaming tides of unreality, something watched with quiet amusement, not mocking, not angry, simply curious to see how long a god could struggle before admitting futility. I confronted the warp more directly than stepping into a place where time peeled back on itself and logic went to die, and then I felt the changer of ways regard me like a collector examining a rare specimen, showing me reflections of myself refracted through 10,000 cult interpretations. Loki the liberator, Loki the betrayer, Loki the necessary. And I understood the trap at last, that if I resisted I would be broken and reshaped, and if I accepted I would endure but cease to be myself. And that was the true horror of this universe. Not that it killed gods, but that it preserved them incorrectly. And as I fled back into real space, wounded not in body but in identity, I felt something fracture inside me, a hairline crack spreading through centuries of defiance. And I wondered for the first time whether survival here required not cleverness or courage, but surrender to becoming a story told by others. And as the dreams continued to spread despite my efforts, I stood alone beneath a sky choked with smog and orbital fire, listening to billions sleep uneasily. And I whispered a promise to myself that if this galaxy insisted on turning me into a monster, then I would choose what kind, even if that choice cost me everything I had ever been. The decision did not come to me like inspiration or revelation but like fatigue, the bone-deep weariness of realizing that every path forward in this galaxy led through blood whether I walked it willingly or not. And so I chose the one that at least allowed me to pretend I still had agency, deciding that if the Imperium and the Warp both insisted on using me, then I would become a fault line between them, something neither could fully control without tearing itself apart. I began carefully seeding contradictions. Instead of rebellions, whispering mutually exclusive prophecies into different strata of imperial society, allowing a cardinal one world to dream of a coming savior, while an inquisitor light years away received a vision of an approaching abomination bearing the same sign. And I watched the machinery strain as it tried to reconcile truths that could not coexist, orders colliding with counter-orders, fleets delayed, purges postponed, and in those small pauses, those fractions of mercy measured in hours rather than years, people lived who would otherwise have died. And I told myself that this mattered, that intent still counted even here. At the same time I reached back into the warp, not in challenge but in mimicry, crafting schemes that looked like the changer's work but bent subtly toward stagnation rather than transformation. And the response was immediate and chilling, a tightening of attention, a god's curiosity sharpening into something like irritation, as futures collapsed and rewrote themselves to compensate for my interference. And I realized that I was no longer merely observed, I was being corrected, reality flexing to accommodate my refusal to play my assigned role. The cost came swiftly, cult cells forming in my name without my guidance, their rituals more extreme, more desperate, because belief here always escalated, and when they slaughtered innocents to appease me, I felt a recoil of nausea I had not known since my earliest rebellions. Because this blood was not spilled in defiance or chaos, but in my shadow, and the Imperium answered as it always did, with fire and extermination. Entire districts cleansed to erase a myth that only grew more vivid in the telling. And I understood then the vicious symmetry of this place, that every attempt to reduce suffering merely redistributed it, concentrated it elsewhere like poison siphoned from one vein to another, hunted now by both Inquisition and Demon. I moved constantly, slipping between war zones where the air shook with artillery and prayers mingled with screams. And in those fields of ruin, I saw humanity at its most honest. Soldiers clinging to dogma because it was lighter than despair. Commissars executing the fearful not out of cruelty, but because fear was contagious. And I felt a grim respect for the Imperium's endurance, even as I despised its methods, because it survived not by hope but by refusal to collapse, a stubbornness so absolute it bordered on the divine. It was on a shattered shrine world, its oceans boiled away by orbital bombardment, that I felt the warp pressed closest, the veil thinning until every thought felt echoed, and there I stood amid cracked statues of the Emperor, my reflection fractured in their broken marble faces, and I laughed again, not from humor but from defiance, declaring myself unclaimed, neither demon nor god of this realm. And the answer came not as wrath but as pressure, a slow squeezing of possibility futures, narrowing until only two remained: absorption or annihilation. And in that narrowing, I glimpsed the terrible truth that this galaxy did not need new players, it needed reinforcement of its eternal conflict, and anything that did not fit would be forced to, one way or another. I chose escalation then, a gambit so reckless it bordered on suicide, deliberately allowing myself to be seen orchestrating a miracle, a genuine one, halting a planetary purge through impossible coincidence and misdirection, letting the rumor spread that I had defied the Inquisition and lived, and the reaction was explosive, faith surging, doubt metastasizing, factions forming overnight, and for a brief, shining moment the galaxy hesitated, its gears grinding as belief pulled in opposing directions, and in that hesitation I felt something like triumph, quickly poisoned by the realization that the pause itself was unsustainable, that the Imperium would respond with annihilation on a scale sufficient to cauterize the wound, and the warp would feast on the resulting despair. And as fleets translated into real space and demonic tides swelled in anticipation, I stood at the center of a storm I had summoned and felt, at last, the weight of responsibility, not as a moral concept but as a gravitational force, dragging everything toward catastrophe. And I wondered whether this was how all gods here learned humility through defeat, but through understanding that every choice, no matter how clever, fed the same endless engine of suffering. And as the first shots were fired and the sky tore itself open with unreality, I braced myself for the moment when the galaxy would decide what to do with a god who refused to behave. The consequences arrived not as chaos, but as order, precise and merciless, because in this galaxy even catastrophe followed procedure, and I felt it in the sudden alignment of forces, as Imperial fleets locked into sanctioned firing patterns, while the warp's tides synchronized their howling into a single resonant pressure that made thought itself feel like a crime. And I understood, with a cold clarity, that my defiance had not created uncertainty but had given both sides a shared objective, the removal of an anomaly that threatened the rhythm of their eternal opposition. Worlds began to burn in my wake with a deliberateness that bordered on ceremonial exterminatus, declared not out of panic but policy, each planet erased, becoming a footnote used to justify the next, and I moved through the devastation like a ghost, watching his own legend devour the innocent, hearing my name twisted into catechisms by cultists and denunciations by priests, both equally convinced they understood me, and neither remotely close. And it was then that I realized the most terrible truth I had yet learned here: impact mattered more than intent, and the universe kept score only in bodies and belief. Hunted relentlessly, I sought refuge not in shadows but in a place of unbearable visibility, a pilgrimage world whose surface was layered with bones and banners, where faith was so dense it distorted reality in small, constant ways, and I stood among the pilgrims without disguise, letting them see me as I was, not glorious, not monstrous, simply present. And for a heartbeat of cosmic time, something extraordinary happened, not a miracle but a hesitation, as belief wavered between awe and doubt, and in that hesitation, I felt the galaxy lean forward, curious whether I would claim the moment and ascend fully into its mythos, but I did not, because I had finally understood the cost, that to become a god here was to become fuel, a fixed point in a war that consumed everything that touched it. The Inquisition struck first, of course, because they always did, and the pilgrims were gunned down in their millions, not because they were guilty, but because they were inconvenient. And as the air filled with smoke and prayer and the sharp finality of ending lives, I felt something in me give way, a brittle pride snapping under the weight of consequence, and for the first time I did not laugh, I simply watched, and that silence was my confession. In the aftermath, amid ruins still warm from orbital fire, I made my choice, the last one that would truly be mine, deciding that if my presence amplified suffering, then my absence would have to be engineered with equal care. and I began the most difficult deception of my existence. Not a lie told to others, but one told to reality itself, unraveling my myth strand by strand, sabotaging my own cult narratives, seeding contradictions so severe they could not be reconciled, turning my legend into static, and the pain of it was exquisite and profound, like tearing memories out by the roots, because gods are made of stories, and I was unmaking mine deliberately. The warp resisted, of course, futures thrashing as they tried to reassert my role, but I persisted, sacrificing power, presence, clarity, allowing myself to become less coherent with each passing moment, until I felt thin, stretched, almost human in my fragility. And in that diminished state, I finally slipped the grasp of the greater powers, not because I had outwitted them, but because I had made myself unprofitable. The Imperium noticed the change only gradually, my name fading from sermons and warnings alike, my cult cells collapsing into incoherence, their symbols losing meaning, and the purges slowed not out of mercy but confusion. And in those pauses, those narrow cracks in the machine, lives continued quietly, unnoticed, and I clung to that small, bitter victory like a lifeline. When at last I withdrew, fully retreating to a forgotten moon whose surface bore the scars of wars too old to remember, I felt profoundly hollow, a god-shaped absence where certainty once lived. And as I looked out across a galaxy, still screaming, still burning, still praying to things that could not love them back, I understood that I had not saved it, not even slightly, but I had refused to make it worse, and in this universe that refusal felt like rebellion enough. And as the warp's laughter receded into a distant annoyed murmur and the Imperium's gaze slid past me toward fresher horrors, I allowed myself a single, quiet hope that anonymity, obscurity, and eventual erasure might be the closest thing to peace this dark millennium would ever permit. And in that hope, fragile and unrecorded, I waited for whatever ending remained. I wandered then, not physically but conceptually, slipping between forgotten battlefields and derelict stations where ghosts of data and faith lingered like dust. And in those places I observed the Imperium's true genius, not its cruelty or might, but its ability to forget, to bury catastrophe beneath procedure until horror became background noise. And I realized that this forgetting was not a flaw but a survival mechanism. A collective lie so necessary that without it humanity would have collapsed under the weight of its own endurance long ago. And in that realization I felt a grudging respect that bordered on sorrow. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when I considered reasserting myself, nudging fate just enough to be noticed again. But each time the echo of burned worlds and silent pilgrim corpses rose unbidden in my thoughts, and I recoiled, because I finally understood that cleverness without restraint was indistinguishable from malice in a universe already drowning in both. And so I remained still, allowing my edges to soften further, my name to fade into half-remembered marginalia in forbidden texts, and when cultists occasionally dreamed of a laughing god who refused their offerings and vanished when they tried to follow, I did not correct them, because even absence becomes a kind of myth here. I watched 1,000 years pass like a single exhausted breath, saw empires fracture, and reform saw heroes canonized and forgotten, saw saints reclassified as heretics when politics shifted, and through it all, the corpse god on Terra endured, neither alive nor dead, a monument to the galaxy's refusal to change course. And I wondered not unkindly whether he too had once made a choice like mine and paid for it in ways no one would ever truly understand. In my quiet observation I felt something unexpected take root. Not hope in the traditional sense, but acceptance. The understanding that meaning here was not found in victory or transformation but in reduction, in choosing not to add another screaming note to an already deafening chorus. And that acceptance settled over me like ash, dull but strangely comforting. And when at last I felt myself slipping toward true dissolution, my thoughts scattering into fragments that no longer cohered into a single, defiant identity, I did not resist, because resistance would have been a form of engagement, and I had learned the cost of being interesting in this galaxy. As I faded,